In 1997, a phone call from a resident of Ellensburg, Washington, Mel Waters, sparked one of the most peculiar and enduring mysteries of our time. Mel claimed there was a bottomless pit near his home, which appeared much like an ordinary well. But in fact, it was no ordinary well. Residents in the vicinity were not aware of its mystery, assuming it was a mine shaft from the gold rush era, thus using it for disposing of a variety of debris, including unwanted furniture, deceased animals, and other refuse. Over time, the hole never showed any signs of filling up, and various inexplicable strange phenomena began to occur. For example, the family's radio would occasionally pick up broadcasts from decades ago, and animals seemed very fearful of approaching the hole. Mel had a dog that usually responded to his calls, but the dog seemed very reluctant to get near the hole. Even birds in the nearby woods were unwilling to land near it. It was as if the hole emitted some sort of aura that made animals uneasy. Mel's house was located right next to this hole. What would he encounter subsequently? Hello everyone, I'm Ling-Si. Today we will talk about the famous urban legend of Mel's Hole. In February 1997, a phone call came through to a renowned talk show program in the US called Coast to Coast in the Deep Night. The caller's name was Mel Waters. He said he had purchased the property where he was living from an elderly couple a few years back. The property was relatively remote and quiet, which he was quite satisfied with. But there was something odd about a nearby hole. It had a diameter of just over 9 feet, which is just under 3 meters. Around the mouth of the hole, there was a retaining wall about 15 feet deep. He initially mistook it for a derelict shaft and thus used it for disposing domestic refuse, casting assorted household junk into it. He wasn't the only one doing this. His neighbors were doing the same. Although they lived farther away, the convenience of the hole was undeniable, so they too dumped large discarded objects into it, including dead cows and sheep. Then, after a number of years, Mel was struck by a curious realization. The pit never seemed to reach its capacity. Having resided there for 4 years, with the land previously under the stewardship of an older couple for over 4 decades, who similarly used the cavity for waste, it remained as dark as ever, with no visible bottom. That's too strange, so Mel decided to test it himself. Being an avid fisherman, he tried to verify whether this hole was just an ordinary well by tying some fishing line to a few dissolvable candies and dropping them into the hole. The apple is completely dry and there is no sign of water solubility, so it is certain that this hole is by no means an ordinary well, and there is no such deep well in reality. In order to test it further, I bought a lot of fishing lines later. This time a 1-pound piece of metal was tied under the line, and the result shocked him. It can be said that it is completely beyond imagination because during this process, the metal has been falling and it has been constantly adjusting and releasing the fishing line. During this period, the fishing line was connected one after another, but in the end, the actual depth of the hole was not measured. Later, it calculated the total length of the fishing line and the result was 80,000 feet, which is about 24,000 meters. What kind of concept is this? The deepest Mariana Trench on Earth is only 11,000 meters. Which means that it has not moved, which is more than twice as long as the Mariana Trench. Besides, he also tested the hole in other aspects, such as shouting into the hole without hearing any echo from inside. When he threw heavy objects inside, he once threw an old refrigerator down, and as a result, he couldn't hear any heavy objects falling to the ground. Once, a neighbor told him a chilling story about the fact that he once threw a dead hound of his own into a hole. But while out hunting a few days later, he saw a dog in the wild, which looked very familiar. When I got closer, I found that not only the coat color was exactly the same as his own hound, but also the collar around his neck was the same. The neighbor was pretty sure this was his previous hound, but when he said hello, the hound didn't respond and seemed to have completely ignored him. This neighbor's story adds another layer of supernatural to Mel's view of the cave. When Mel finished telling his story on the phone, a large number of enthusiastic listeners called in to advise Mel. Some people say whether to drop another live cat down and see if something happens. This idea was rejected by the host on the spot because it was evil. Some people also suggested that radar could be used to detect the specific depth of the hole first to see if it was 80,000 feet. Said that because he suspected limitations, he had already bottomed out. However, this hole is indeed relatively deep, and the fishing line in the suspended part has enough weight to keep the roller sliding down, giving people the illusion that the Mel hole is bottomless. Finally, there was another who was not afraid of death and said that he was willing to go down and have a look in person with lights and radios, provided that a safe cage was built for him to prevent anything terrible from really existing at the bottom of the cave. Coast to Coast was a very popular program in the 1990s, with listeners all over the United States, so it may be because of this phone call that something unexpected happened later. A week later, it was another weekend night, and the program group received another call from Mel. After the show on Friday evening, went out there and observed there appeared to be some helicopter operations in the vicinity of the property.
The helicopter activity will continue the next day.
Thus, it appears that there must be individuals tuning into your broadcasts. A few days ago, he went to a nearby town to run some errands, and on his way back, he stopped by the supermarket. When he returned home, he found a large area around his house cordoned off. It wasn't the police standing outside the tape, but fully armed soldiers. He asked a soldier about it and was told that a plane had just crashed, so the area was completely sealed off. Mel found this strange because he hadn't seen any fire or smoke. There was no noticeable smell in the air either. After explaining that he owned the property, a person in charge came over and said that until the cause of the accident was entirely clear, he couldn't enter his home. Mel was angered and asked why he couldn't go back to his own house. Surprisingly, he was told that just because it was his house didn't mean it was truly his. They said it would be easy to find evidence of a drug lab in his home. Mel candidly told the program that he indeed had a lab at his place where he collected herbs for alternative therapy, but it was certainly not a drug lab. Given how they had put it, he wasn't foolish and realized what was happening and left. Subsequently, he visited his neighbor, who disclosed something peculiar. They glimpsed a jet of dark light, reminiscent of a spotlight, originating from the crevice while passing by one night. This light was utterly black, manifesting quite an uncanny appearance. They were baffled as to the nature of this enigmatic light. An aged neighbor mentioned that there once stood old pillars in the vicinity that had crumbled over the years. Should this account hold truth, it implies the hole near Mel's residence possesses an extensive antiquity. Then, the next day, a property broker reached out to him, querying whether he had intentions of selling his domicile. Seeing that an interested purchaser was presenting an attractive offer, he immediately understood this was a carrot and stick situation. If he didn't agree, he could be falsely accused of being a drug dealer. If he did, he would get a hefty sum. He withheld immediate consent, stating contemplation was necessary. Over the ensuing period, he kept watch from afar and noted the Army's deployment of generators and temporary structures, with personnel frequenting his abode as though it were a military installment. After hearing Mel's story, listeners called in with their thoughts. Some said that they had also seen. When I was studying at a university near Allensburg, I did hear a professor tell the story of a bottomless cave in the local area, but I never knew its location. This statement provides some credibility to Mel's story, and some people make bold speculations. Mel Cave was actually the gateway to another dimension, and it might even cause time and space disorder, which was why the previous puppy came back from the dead. Some people think that this hole may lead to the depths of the center of the Earth, which just corresponds to the theory of hollow Earth. The so-called hollow Earth theory refers to the fact that there may be an empty world deep in the center of the Earth, with its own light source, climate, organisms, and even civilization. If this theory is correct, then all the trash that Mel and his neighbors had previously discarded would have fallen on the heads of the Earthmen. I think every time they throw away garbage, the people in the center of the Earth must break the hole and scold. But no matter what, now Mel must face a cruel truth. That is, you can't go back to a home. And after this second call, he seemed to have vanished into thin air, and there was no news from him again. Meldon's story is very famous in the United States, and it is often mentioned today. There are people who believe in this, and of course, there are many people who doubt it. Then I will talk about the two main views held by doubters. First, they question why Mel hadn't disclosed his specific address. If we had a specific address, we could see if it was true or not, and we would know at a glance. Even if the place has been sealed off by the military, at least circumstantial evidence can be seen. On this point, the host Adbel had asked Mel when he first called in. At that time, Mel was hesitant to reveal his specific location. He was afraid that a large number of people would come and disturb his life after the announcement. Later, when he was threatened by the military, it might be out of concern, so he didn't mention it again. Second, there are people who question that the structure of Meyer Cave cannot exist. People who have studied civil engineering should know that piling is needed when building houses and bridges. The holes after piling cannot be put on hold for too long, and concrete must be poured in time. Otherwise, it will easily collapse. The impact hole is usually only tens of meters, and at most hundreds of meters. If it was true, as Mel said, the hole was at least 20,000 meters long, then this is definitely an engineering myth. To take a step back, even if someone or some force could dig such a deep hole at the beginning, if it was not maintained after digging, it would collapse in a few days at most. Therefore, the previous listener's view may be correct. That is, the fishing line has already bottomed out. But the fall caused by the weight of the fishing line gives people the illusion that the plum ears are bottomless. On the other hand, however, the later textual research of the show host Adbel supported Mel's statement. It turned out that after receiving the second phone call, the radio station sent staff to the field investigation. They didn't find the cave at that time, but they did find the military near the mountains that Mel had previously identified. Signs of activity? Maybe these are the same people who had previously occupied Mel's property. It is precisely because there are positive and negative evidences on both sides that the whole incident has become confusing, and it has been talked about so far. Time flies. 3 years have passed in the blink of an eye, and the hero of the legend of Mel Cave has returned. One day, the program group received another phone call claiming to be Mel Waters. He said that 3 years ago, someone leased his land for a heavy sum of $250,000 a month, but there were two conditions. First, he had to sign a confidentiality agreement and promise not to tell anyone about it. Second, he must leave the United States immediately and never come back. Mel weighed the pros and cons, and finally couldn't resist the temptation of money and agreed to it. So that's why he went into thin air in the first place. After that, he lived a comfortable life in Australia. But 2 years later, because he missed his family and friends too much, he quietly returned to America. During this time, he contacted Adbel and agreed to join the radio show again about what happened in both years. Unexpectedly, on the day of participating in the program, an accident happened. He was riding a bus when two people on the bus quarreled and started fighting, so the driver immediately called the police. After the police arrived, they began to question the passengers on the bus one by one. As for what happened afterwards, Mel said that he didn't remember it at all. Later, he was woken up by a tramp in a dirty alley in San Francisco. When he asked, he learned that 12 days had passed. When he got up and checked, he found that his documents and wallet had disappeared, and there were several suspicious pinholes on his arms, as well as strangulation marks tied with tape. As he slowly awoke, he discovered a back tooth had been extracted. The rationale remains a mystery. The bad thing doesn't stop there. When he returned to Allensburg, he found that his land had been confiscated by the government, and the reason given was actually the illegal construction of electricity system and septic tank. You know, he has lived in Australia for the past 2 years. The actual user of this land is the government itself, so this is obviously a frame-up. To make matters worse, all the money in the bank card was also removed. Some people may not understand, so I'll give you a timeline here. Mel came back after 2 years in Australia. He had already contacted Adbel at that time, but he broke the appointment on the day of the show. The reason is that he was kidnapped, and now on the show is a year after he was kidnapped. Okay, so back to our story. Just when the property and deposit were both confiscated, a group of people found Mel. Son, this group of people who call themselves Basques had settled in the United States as early as the early 19th century. They now live somewhere in Nevada, herding sheep for a living. The reason he came to see Mel was to invite him to investigate another pothole that was very similar to Mel's cave. It ended up being so. There is also a pothole in the Basque territory. According to their ancestors' word of mouth, this is a bottomless pit. Originally, the Basques also took care of their own sheep, and no one had time to study this pothole. It wasn't until Mel's story was broadcast on a talk show and caused a sensational effect that aroused a strong curiosity among the Basques. So they had the idea of further investigation. The Basque legend aroused Mel's great interest, so he immediately agreed to the invitation. The group then rushed to Nevada non-stop to launch an investigation. Mel discovered that the diameter of this hole was about the same as the previous hole, which was also close to 3 meters. The difference is that there is no retaining wall at the entrance of the hole, but the entrance of this hole is made of metal, and when you put your hand in it, there will be a warm feeling, as if there is a hot air steaming out. At Mel's suggestion, they first lifted a bucket of ice to a depth of about 400 meters. After a while, I lifted it up and saw that the ice cube showed no sign of melting at all. What's even more strange is that I didn't feel cold when I put my hand on it, just like touching a bucket of salt. They tried to heat the ice bucket again, but they were shocked to find that the ice cubes not only did not melt, instead, it was ignited like solid alcohol. They tried this kind of event many times in a row. The final conclusion is that sometimes ice cubes will melt normally, but sometimes ice cubes will be converted into unknown substances as they just did. Soon after, the group decided to do another experiment with living creatures. As the Basques raised a lot of sheep nearby, after discussion, they decided to pack a live sheep into a crate and then slowly hang it deep underground to see what would happen then. When the sheep approached the cave, they behaved with golden sentences, as if they were screaming hysterically. This reaction was not surprising at all, because the previous male cave would also emit a terrifying aura. In the end, the crate was transferred to a depth of more than 400 meters. This is not to say that more than 400 meters is the limit of this hole, but the rope they bring with them is only so long. The sheep stayed at a depth of more than 400 meters underground for almost half an hour before being pulled up. At this time, there was no movement at all in the box. When he opened it, he saw that it was indeed dead. Actually, this is quite normal, because generally speaking, oxygen can hardly reach a depth of more than 400 meters, so even if sheep are not scared to death, they will die of suffocation. What really surprised everyone was that the sheep's abdomen seemed to be squirming slightly, as if there was something inside. Someone suggested on the spot to cut it open and have a look. So, when one of them cut open the abdomen with a knife, he was surprised to find that the abdominal cavity of the tooth had been swollen with a huge sac. The previous peristalsis of all space was exactly this cyst, but this time they saw it clearly. The cyst was beating slowly like a heart. The surgeon, so he took the courage to carefully cut the cyst open. The sight before them instantaneously petrified them, etching the moment into their memories forever. Inside the cyst, unbelievably, there was a living creature that looked like a seal, but with human-like eyes. It scrutinized each person in the room with a gaze seemingly full of wisdom. After a long look, the seal slowly moved to the edge of the table. Feeling it wanted to come down, Mel summoned his courage and placed it on the ground. His hands ended up covered in foul-smelling mucus. Finally, the little seal slowly approached the cave under everyone's watchful eyes and eventually disappeared into it. Meanwhile, Mel was diagnosed with late-stage esophageal cancer while living in Australia. The doctor had told him he had about 6 months left to live, but after this event, his esophageal cancer miraculously healed. Do you remember the ice blocks from earlier? Once, a curious Basque man brought one home and put it in a fireplace. Amazingly, the ice block continued to burn for several months with unquenchable flames, making the house not only warm but very dry, leaving everyone inside parched. It seemed that the ice block absorbed large amounts of moisture from the air. After hearing this story, host Art Bell strongly urged him to bring some footage from Nevada, as the Basque man had recorded the entire testing process. Mel hesitated but eventually agreed. Mysteriously, after this conversation, he disappeared without a sign. To present times, the myth of Mel's Hole is still prevalent in the US.
Numerous seekers have endeavored to locate its exact place, some even declaring they found it, but these were just deserted mines or natural sinkholes. No real Mel's Hole. In my opinion, if the story had ended with the government forcibly leasing Mel's property, Mel's Hole would be an excellent urban legend, inspiring endless imagination. Unfortunately, Mel's return 2 years later for a cave exploration in Nevada made the story seem overly exaggerated, leading many to believe he was a complete fraud. However, while listening to Art Bell's show, I noticed something unusual. Mel was a guest on the broadcast 5 instances, resulting in 5 separate recordings. The initial pair of episodes was from 1997, but when hearing the third, Mel's comeback, there was a noticeable change in his voice. This sentiment is echoed by many online. It's unclear if the show confirmed his identity when Mel came back in 2000. However, I have serious doubts it was the actual Mel, rather than an imposter. It could have been a story fabricated out of vanity. Lastly,
I've uploaded the original audio recordings so you can compare them on your own. You see, this hole has been there since the moment we moved in, and even long before when the elderly former owner resided there. I'd estimate he occupied that place for at least 30, perhaps even 40 years prior to our arrival. Throughout that time, all of us have been discarding our waste and debris into that cavern. The neighbors also throw their stuff into the hole. It's been happening for a long time, you know. I became quite intrigued by this cavity located on my land. I surmised that your extensive following might assist me in uncovering more details, given that I have previous experience in shark fishing in California with sizable spools. Indeed, there must have been roughly 1,200 yards worth of fishing lines submerged,